Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, and we are at Cadence Independent Media about to do a really specific viewer request that actually several viewers have asked for. It's kind of a deep dive into the Masshoff tuning method for your snare drum. We're going to get into a little bit of the science behind it, why it does what it does, some of the things you need to watch out for if you're going to try it out, and just, how it might work for you. So I have to say, the first time that somebody asked about this, I actually didn't know what it was. I'd sort of heard that there were people doing kind of like unbalanced tuning tensions on their snare drum to get muffling out of it, or to kind of create a scheme where they could get a lot of sounds with a minimal amount of adjustment to the batter head. So first off, Udo Masshoff is a drummer, and he came up with this method. He has a sort of tutorial on YouTube to do this, and there are some other people that are also demonstrating it. But I haven't found that much information about why the sound is what it is when you do these sorts of things to your drum, and also addressing some of the things that could be troublesome or that aren't super clear, or at least they weren't to me when I watched it, and some things to watch out for with regards to your drum, your heads, and particularly your hoops. So what we're going to do here is we're going to basically go through fairly quickly the method itself, step by step, in the same way that he does, but I'm going to kind of annotate it with things that you should pay attention to when you're doing it that I felt like weren't addressed enough for my personal taste. The instructions for this tuning method are to crank the snare side head, and if you've watched our previous videos, you know that we have our own opinions about really tuning the snare side head super high, but I don't want to deviate from the method. I want to do exactly the way that the instructions were given to me. So the first thing we're going to do is crank up the snare side head, and the definition in his video of cranked is to get the snare side head finger tight and then do 2 complete turns on every lug in the normal star pattern. So we'll go ahead and do that and put the wires on, and we'll catch you on the batter side. Something important to note about this is if you're going to do this kind of tuning where you're cranking one lug at a time, as you move around, the lugs are going to lose their finger tightness that you had at the beginning, so you're going to have to re-finger tight them one at a time as you come to them. As you're going around the head, you don't want to be just going from where it was set in the first place. You have to just use your fingers to bring it back down to the hoop and then do your 2 complete turns. And also, we'll talk a little bit later about this, but depending on the type of hoop you're using, like something stiffer like a die-cast hoop, you may experience this more dramatically because the hoop itself won't be deforming as much and bending to the tension of the rest of the lugs. That's going to be a bigger deal when we get to the batter side, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. One other variable in the original tutorial video that isn't really mentioned is that the drum that he's using has ultra-wide 42-strand snare wires on it. I consider those to be uncommon, and 20, maybe between 16 and 24 is sort of like the common range. Most people don't use ultra-wide wires, but they do project a kind of sustain and fatness out of a drum, even when it's not tuned super great. They also just color the tone a little bit, and they themselves can muffle the drum a little bit. We're choosing to use 20 strands since that's the middle of the road and probably what's on your drum, most likely. So, your results may vary depending on your wires. They are actually kind of important for this sort of tuning method. But 20 is the norm, so that's what we're doing. All right, so we are round to the batter side, and this is where things become important for this tuning method. We have cranked up the bottom head. It's real tight. And now we're going to start this tuning method that he has devised for getting options in your batter head with small adjustments to just a couple of the lugs, from bright and ringy and full of overtones to extremely dead and fat sounding, a la like a new wave thing, or even like an AC/DC kind of sound. So we'll rifle through this. You can watch his tutorial too, but first step is 1 complete turn on all of the lugs in a star pattern, just like you were tuning the drum up. And I will mention that I didn't use a ruler on the snare side like I normally do, because I'm trying to do this exactly as prescribed. Just for reference, we're using this same 70s Supraphonic that we always use. The drum that he uses in the video is a 10 lug drum, so We're just kind of trying to use something super run-of-the-mill, as per usual, something that's kind of a baseline normal thing. Also, same as with the snare side head, finger tight all around before you do this, and you may have to spin them back up again after you tension a few because they will get loose again. One complete turn on all of the lugs. Next step is we assign jobs to each of these lugs. The 3 lugs furthest away from me are responsible for retaining the high overtones of the drum. And the idea here is that if you put muffling on your drum, you're taking away high overtones. And the hope here is that we're going to get a muffled sound without squashing high overtones. So the next step is we raise the lug furthest away from me another entire turn. I know it sounds crazy, but these are the rules. And then the 2 lugs adjacent to the one furthest away from me get boosted half a turn. Next thing is we're going to reduce tension on the 3 lugs in front of me. The center lug directly in front of me gets 0 tension. It gets backed out all the way and then just like finger tight so it doesn't rattle. And the 2 lugs adjacent to it go down a turn and a half, which sounds bizarre and is mentioned in the original video because we only raised the opposing lug 1 turn. So how are we going to back this out a turn and a half? Well, we're going to do it. So here we go. So what we've done here is we've created an offset tuning scheme where the tension on the head is on this side of the drum, and then there's a gradual loss of tension on this side of the drum. This results in wrinkles directly in front of me and a extra tight lug directly across. Now, when you're talking about a drum having a lot of overtones and a lot of sustain and those sorts of things, having the head in tune with itself is going to promote sustain and is going to promote overtones because all of the nodes of tuning are talking to each other and throwing the sound back and forth. The idea behind this is that we are adding tension to some of the nodes and taking other tension away from other nodes to squash overtones, but maintain a center that still feels like a drum that's tuned in the mid-range, even though once we got to the even tuning before we started adjusting stuff like this, it was tuned pretty high. It was very high. But it's not important how high because we didn't choose a pitch. We just did turns. And so this also means that on a given drum, it might feel, look, sound different than on another drum. But here is the thing that's important about this. This is a 10 lug drum, and the instructions for this tuning method are 10 lug drum specific because each of these nodes has a job. And if you only have 8 or 6 lugs, you have less nodes to work with, and those each of those is going to have a much bigger effect on the sound when you adjust it. Second thing to know is that since we have a uneven tension on the head intentionally that's pretty dramatic, I can take this out with my fingers, and this is very, very tight. Our head is tensioned unevenly, and if we wanted to use this head later with an evenly tensioned batter hoop, it's gonna sound squirrely and weird, and it might not tune up at all because we've crushed the collar, as you do when you tune a head up, unevenly. So if you set this head on a table after it's been tuned up like this for a few days, it's gonna, the surface of the head is actually gonna be crooked. And fortunately, drum heads, like a snare batter, not very expensive. Things that can get expensive are hoops. And we are also unevenly tensioning the batter hoop pretty dramatically. Now, the material and type of hoop that you're using and the rigidity of that style of hoop is going to affect this process a lot. This is a vintage, from this drum, triple flange hoop. The original video with the originator of this tuning method had S hoops on his batter side. I have zero experience with those, but people tell me that they are sort of a split the difference between die cast and a triple flange. So we're sort of working with something thinner that's either going to be on a vintage drum or something trying to be vintage or possibly a budget drum too, just because it's a lighter material. Die cast, I feel like, especially if it's a stiffer die cast, you're going to run into some kind of strange behavior with this because it will exert more tension on the lugs next to the lug that you're tensioning than this type of hoop because the whole thing is so stiff. So if you're looking for a big differential and you want this lug to be totally loose, these ones here are going to be putting a lot more pressure on this with a stiffer hoop than with this one. So again, your results will vary a lot depending on that material, maybe more so even than the drum that you're using, because this is a very hoop and head centric tuning style rather than tuning everything evenly and seeing what the drum sounds like or wants to do. Just as an aside, if I was going after this kind of tuning myself, or if someone, like if I was teching a studio session and they were like, I want this tuning style, when I tensioned up the batter head, I probably would have evened out the pitches, not so much for the way that it's going to sound at the end of all of this, but more just for how it's going to feel. And if you are dialing in the overtones, you do want those to be in tune with themselves if you're going for like the higher version of this sound. But again, along with not measuring the height of the snare side, I didn't adjust anything. I didn't tune pitch-wise anything at all. We just did turns, counted the turns, and that's it. So let's see what we have. We're going to find out what this thing sounds like. All right, this is an interesting sound. I'm gonna do a little bit of adjustment to now the side lugs, which in this tuning method are considered the tone lugs, which are basically for the pitch of the drum. So these here are for muffling, these here are for tone or pitch, and these here are retaining the high end of the drum. Let's lower the tone a little bit and see what that does. I'm going to lower the outside lugs here, the tone lugs, half a turn each, and just get a little comparison quickly of what we just did. The first thing that it sounds like is like the snare wires are super loose, and I assure you they're not. They are actually right at the edge of choking the drum. If you play it softly, you can hear that it's choking, and if you play it hard, they splatter all over the place, which is actually kind of cool. I think it's cool. It's a little more resonant than I was expecting given the sort of like deadness intent of this. But at the same time, it did change the sound a ton to just move these lugs. Now quickly, I'm going to put it back where it was, and I'm going to do the opposite direction. I'm going to go more overtones. And to do that, we're going to put these tone guys back where they were, and we're going to raise these three up. It's not super clear in the video exactly how much to raise these. I think you kind of have to use your ear like for what you're aiming for. But when I do these, I'm going to play in the center of the drum as I raise them, and you're going to hear the high overtone jump in. This is starting to get into sort of more of the run-of-the-mill high-tuned snare sound. It's still pretty apparent to me that all of the lugs are at slightly different tensions because I can hear some dissonance in the overtones. But now it kind of feels a little more normal and a little less pillowy. And obviously there's a lot more overtone there and a lot more crack. And so, as I understand it, the intent behind this tuning method is to have a situation where you can just adjust a couple of lugs to get a dramatically different sound out of your drum. And it definitely does do that. Now, less of a critique, but more of just something that I think is important is that Earlier on when we were experimenting, I kind of A-B'd a little bit the idea of evenly tuning the batter head, but with that amount of turns in mind. So I did the one turn per lug on the batter side, and then I went around it and I evened them. The result I thought was actually better than this. So that's something to keep in mind. If you start out with an evenly tuned batter head, this kind of method is going to get you better results. So really quickly, I'm going to take all the tension off the batter head. I'm going to leave the snare side where it was because it's working for this method. And I'm going to do what I just said, which is I'm going to do one turn per lug, but then I'm actually going to tune the batter head so that it's in tune with itself. And then do the instructions as we did them before and see how it compares to where we just were. Quick touch base, and halfway through this, I did full turns in the star pattern like before, but I haven't fixed the tuning yet. And this is an opportunity to notice that if you're gonna do a full turn on a lug and then cross and do a full turn and then a full turn and then a full turn, you're not actually getting even tension on the lugs because the rest of the hoop is coming down too. And that's why when I'm tuning a drum, I do a quarter turn or less at a time to get it in tune, because I want to make sure that I'm not affecting the adjacent lugs that much by how much I'm lowering the hoop toward the drum, as evidenced by like these three pitches right here. So now I'm just going to go around, normal thing, even out the pitches, and then go through the tuning method. So we've gone through 3 levels of tuning here. We did finger tight, and then we did whole turns adjusting to finger tight when the things got too loose again. And now I chose to go upward in the tuning to even things out. I kind of found where it was highest, and I brought everything else up to that, which was a fraction of a turn. It wasn't even like, it was like 1/8 of a turn. It was really, really small. And now the head is in tune with itself, but overall, it's a little bit higher than the last example because of the evening out and the finger tightening and all that stuff. So now real quick, I'm going to set it up and then we'll see how it sounds. So apart from evening out the tension on the batter head after going up the full turn, this is the exact same tuning method front to back as we did before. Okay, now we're getting into something that sounds a little more to me like where he's at in the video, and it is actually a usable sound. It is overall muffled in the overtones. It's still resonant enough that you can hear the wires going when I'm talking, which is great. The overtones are squashed pretty hard. It feels pretty soft. It's not particularly reboundy. Doing double strokes and things on a drum like this, it still feels kind of pillowy. But it is an interesting alternative, at the very least, to throwing moon gel and things like that on your drums. I'm not 100% in agreement with the idea that there's more high overtone in this right now than there would be if I had just put a moon gel on the drum. But the ease with which you can get back high overtones and make it start to sound like a ska drum or something like that really fast is actually pretty interesting. So just to wrap up, basically what we're working with here is a tuning scheme where you can sort of have preset ideas in your head of how you can turn the screws to get different sounds. Without being hypercritical of a certain tuning method, I can say that I probably wouldn't use this in performance personally because I already have systems in place for getting the sounds that I need, and they involve adding things to the drum or setting up a specific tuning. I also think that if I was on a sort of gig where I was going to need two different sounds, I would probably just bring two different snares, since they are small and one extra snare stand isn't that big of a deal to bring. And I think it's also worth noting that the greatest part of the sound of this method is dead center in the drum. And some of the lower tunings, the rim shot sound is kind of boxy and a little bit choked. That may have more to do with how high the snare side is tuned than just having the batter head to blame. The sound with the snares off is pretty iffy. The overtones, especially the low fundamental parts, the lower parts of the overtones that are nearer to the fundamental are very wobbly, and they are different depending on where you hit the drum. So you can't, for instance, move your sticks from the center of the head to the edge and expect those two edges to behave the same. So all that said, the other thing is that if your drum is something that you spend a fair amount of money on because of the construction, the design, and certain aspects of it that generate the sound that you like out of that drum, this is going to minimize the effect that has. Where this kind of methodology shines is if you only own one drum and you do need to get a bunch of sounds out of it in a hurry. This definitely does that. There are some integrity of sound compromises intrinsic to the head not being in tune with itself, but there are also situations where that's not particularly important or high on the priority level. One of the things that the designer of this tuning method mentions in his video is if you're in a set list and all of a sudden you realize that you need a different sound just for one song, this does beat retuning your whole drum from scratch in between the two songs on, like a wedding gig or something like that. That's real, but it's definitely a different sort of sound than I would necessarily go for. I have my own ways of doing these sorts of things, and I still think you have to follow your ear to get the sound that you want. But the other thing that I think is important about this, and that I want people who haven't tried this or maybe have tried it and struggled with it to know, is that it's not a replacement for having your batter head in tune. The difference between the first demonstration and then actually tuning the batter head and then making these adjustments is pretty dramatic. And I can hear it in the overtones, I can hear it in the fundamental, and also this is louder in the room than the last thing. And that's the problem with muffled drums in the first place. A lot of the time is that you're losing a lot of volume, but you want that kind of fat sound without a lot of overtones. And to be fair, I don't really use that sound live as much as I do in the studio, so the volume maybe isn't as important, but at the same time, that loss of high overtones that we're trying to alleviate with this tuning scheme is also not a big deal, because the point of it is a dull drum. So for me, this has just been a really interesting experiment to try something out that I had zero familiarity with, and hopefully this will help people decide if this is something that they want to spend their time on, because there is a little more fussing with it than you might have imagined as far as it being like a trick or whatever. But it's definitely worth experimenting with. Just realize that the types of hoops you have, the type of head you're using, maybe even the drum you have, all of those things are going to affect how functional this method is. And I think it's worth saying that it does take a lot of the character of your personal drum out of the mix when you do this, because you're not getting that full interaction of the head with the drum, which we've talked about in previous tuning videos, particularly the bass drum video, but also with this. And I think that if it's a sound that works for you, then it's 100% valid and you should do it, but there are certain things to it that are worth paying attention to. And I hope that this has been helpful. And if you like what you see, please comment, subscribe, like the video, tell people about it. If you have experience with this or any other sort of unusual tuning method with your snare, we're definitely interested in hearing about it. This was super fun.